Well, hello and welcome to this week's Midpoint. I'm here with Andrew, and we're talking through your sermon, Justified. Mm-hmm. And so we always start off with the question, like, is there anything you want to cover? So let's do that. So what in this message, if anything, you wanted to... Hi, by the way.
Well, we're just gonna move all around here.
I did have an intro in mind. I don't typically like to script anymore. Okay. So let's start over.
Welcome to Midpoint, OCC's midweek podcast aimed at helping you connect with last week's message and prepare you for next week's sermon. Let's dive in.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you, buddy? Good to see you.
We are coming off of VBS.
Oh my goodness gracious!
It's been fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
tired.
fifth grade. You have fifth grade.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which I like. I mean, I have a good group of kids.
Yeah.
It's fun. And you're in games. So you're just running around
Yes.
all day.
Yes, pretty much.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, how fast could you go to sleep right now if you just had a bed and just like if you laid down?
Oh, probably within minutes. I was seriously contemplating turning off the light in my office and laying down on my couch for about 20 minutes, but because I also have youth group tonight.
Yeah.
And so we're playing kickball, and I'm like, I need to
So you're
also...
burning the calories today.
Yeah.
Getting all your steps in.
I don't even want to know how many steps I've taken already today.
Yeah.
It's going to be ridiculous, but dude, it is what it is. So
yeah, I was telling somebody that, kids are not my strong suit. Like I can do it. And I think my group is really fun and they're responding to me well, but there's a reason I'm a worship pastor and a children's pastor. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I was telling somebody that we were talking about how much that, drains you of just kind of being...
For sure.
And I'm like, well, luckily, I'm also running sound with Daniel, and I'm doing, some lights.
Yeah.
So I get to kind of step away and get a little bit of a breather. And so that's been helpful for me. Have you had a chance to get a breather, or you...
No. I'm so much of my time... The beauty of it is that I've been gifted a lot of my youth kids as my helpers with games.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it's a huge blessing, but part of that is I'm also trying to just invest and care for them, but I'm using a lot of the time, too, of not being on the mic to then teach and train them.
Yeah. I noticed that you were having all the kids kind of say things, and so that was all intentional, just to kind of give them leadership skills.
Oh, yeah, leadership skills, and
nice.
A lot of it is, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but there's times that I'll quietly kind of slip behind one of the guys talking and be like, hey, let's not say X, Y, and Z. Let's not tell a bunch of kids to whatever.
Yeah.
Let's not snack
coach them a little bit.
Yeah, trying to coach them.
Yeah.
One of the kids we were talking about, we're playing the game Lifeguard with the parachute.
Okay.
Which is a fun game. If you don't know that game, it's you have a parachute and you have to shake it. And you have a lifeguard. You have sharks underneath that are pulling people under the parachute, and you have lifeguards. Yeah. And one of my kids was talking about it and coaching, and she goes on live mic, and we have all of our neighbors and everything. She goes, "Oh, someone just died," and I was like, "Come here. Let's not say died on live mic to an entire neighborhood." And she's like, "Oh, sorry." I was like, it's okay. So just some of that where I'm like, just coaching. So it just results in not a whole lot of breaks because I'm trying to eat up all that time with coaching and loving and caring. And
so you're not only planning all the games and stuff like that, but then you're coaching and
I'm
kind of being mindful.
Yeah.
That's exhausting.
It's fun. It's a blast. And I wouldn't have it any other way because it results in me getting to just spend a week-long time with all my students. Sure. Which is literally the greatest blessing it can be.
Pouring into them.
Yeah, but it's exhausting. And so, by the end of it, I'm like, oh, here we go. Yeah. So it's a lot. But we have a blast. It's been really good. We sadly today, we're just going to talk about VBS now, whatever. We had a game planned, and I was really bummed. We started a game off with our first group, which was fourth grade, and had like 6 or 7 kids get injured playing the game. And so we're like, and we're going to nix that game. And so then it resulted in us having to scramble and try variations. The variations didn't go well for the next group, and so then we scrambled the rest of the day and just tried to figure out something else that worked. But that was a bummer. That was a bummer today of having this game that I was super excited about. We had this giant soccer ball that's 7 feet tall. We were going to play soccer with the kids. And then kids kept getting mowed over by the soccer ball.
Get out of the way.
Yeah, it's their own fault. Yeah. Anyway, so we had to nix the game.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I heard about the giant soccer ball, and I was like, we're going to, because we're the last group. Yeah. I was like, we're going to do this. It's going to be great. And then it was like, everybody line up. We're playing sharks and minnows.
Yeah.
Like,
the reason was because we had like 7 kids get injured the very start of the day, and I just could not rationalize playing the game. And part of it was we go 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, kindergarten, and then 5th. Mm-hmm. And so in my brain, I'm like, we could possibly play it with 5th. But then I'm realizing every grade we go down, I'm just going to get more injuries. Mm-hmm. And then every grade we go down, you're going to see this giant 7-foot soccer ball sitting off to the side. And people are going to want to play with it.
Yeah.
And so we just deflated it, even though we probably could have played it with 5th. But if we waited until 5th, I was going to have, all these age groups going, well, I want to play with that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can't rationalize that many injuries.
Yeah.
I just can't. And so we deflated it, even though we probably could have waited for 5th.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, if I want to play the good, fun games, 4th grade, that's where it's at.
Well, yeah, I mean, we do a test run on 4th grade.
Okay. They're the guinea pigs.
Yeah, they're guinea pigs.
Gotcha.
And so sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't. It was fun, but we just had like 6 or 7 injuries.
Sure.
None of them, if you're listening, none of them were serious. They were pretty minor injuries. But still, when you have like 6 or 7 kids sitting off to the side crying, it's a rough game.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
well, good call. I know it's all your volunteers are like, dang it, man, that was a lot of fun.
Well, I think we had like chapel people watching, we had people in gathering grounds watching, and so I was literally hearing throughout the day of like, oh, we can't wait to play this game. We can't wait to play this game because everyone had seen it.
Yeah.
And then we scratched it, and I couldn't rationalize it.
Yeah.
No,
that makes sense.
So it just wasn't a wise idea to be like, yeah, we're going to play a game that results in this many injuries.
Yeah.
And so we scratched it.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, no, it's been good. I've enjoyed VBS, and thank you guys for a lot of you guys that are listening have either been helping or have dropped off your kids to be a part of it. So thanks for that.
Praying on top of that, we know we feel very blessed by this, and so it's been a blast.
Yeah. So all right, now we can get into your sermon.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. So you walked through Romans 3:24 to 31.
Okay.
And 24 is kind of in the middle
of
a sentence, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of that's. I'm assuming that's why you went all the way back to, what is it, 21?
So I think James said this. I don't think this is any secret. James originally had scheduled me to start at 27.
Okay.
Is where I was originally scheduled to start, was 3:27 through 31. I think just due to timing and amount of verses and what he was trying to get in, he didn't feel like he could get through 27. So he stopped at 23. And so then that just resulted in me kind of picking up at a weird spot, which was fine. It worked well. It honestly fit well. But it was a chunk. It was a huge chunk, and it was a weird kind of, that's why I went back and started at 21. Yeah,
because you got to get the context.
I have to get the context because we pick up in the middle of a sentence. And even 22, I think, starts the sentence. 22 and then runs into 23, and then 23 runs into 24.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, I'm trying to look at my phone here too. I think 22 starts the thought? No. 21 starts. No, 23 starts the thought, but it connects back to 22 still. So it's all connected, and everything connects, and so you have to kind of piece it together. And so that's why I went back to 21.
Okay. Was there anything that in your prep that as you finalized the sermon, was there anything that you were like, man, I wish I would have had 15 more minutes, 20 more minutes to be able to really dive into that?
I wrestled with that because there was a lot there, and I struggle at times because I want to go down every rabbit hole, and I want to just be able to flex everything out that I can, but I didn't want to take forever, and I kind of felt like the sweet spot for me with this one was about 30, 35 minutes, and so that's where I kind of stopped. There was something that it was funny, as I was working back through the sermon passage later Sunday, I found something that I didn't have time to really go into, and I wish I would have. Where is it? It's 2:30, I think it is. Verse 30 says this: "Since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith." And what kind of popped out to me, and I wish I would have spent more time on it and been able to really flesh it out, is the differences there. Mm-hmm. Who will justify the circumcised by faith, but then the uncircumcised through faith. Those two words are intentional, by and then through. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense when you look at the idea of what he's talking to about the circumcised. They are God's people, and so they are needing to be by faith, but then the uncircumcised need to be then saved through the process of faith. I wish I would have spent more time on that. Mm-hmm. And it just wasn't, it didn't get in. It just
Didn't fit with the flow.
Didn't fit with where we're going.
Yeah.
But that's one of those things that you have parts of this that you just can't get in, that you can't have, you just don't have time for. You're moving, you're trying to keep going. And so
get into it. So just for somebody who was, picking up, this is the, they're like, oh, I want to know, like, what would you have kind of mentioned about the by and the through?
Yeah. And I think part of it is that I kicked myself because I didn't even research it. I didn't spend time even researching it. And so that was me kicking myself a little bit too, of reading back through it later and being like, oh, bummer. I really wish I would have researched that. But I think in my brain, as I look at that, you have to understand that circumcised is referring to God's chosen people. Mm-hmm. Those are people that he chose, and then were evidence of them being God's chosen people were circumcision.
Through the ritual of circumcision.
Through the ritual of circumcision. That was part of it. And so they are, justify the circumcision by faith, right? We are originally pre-Jesus, it was people were saved by faith. They were justified before God by faith. And so talking about that idea, I think that wording there, by faith, is very intentional. But then I think it's interesting that he uses a different wording, the uncircumcised through faith, that there is a process that they still need to go through as uncircumcised to then be saved through the process of faith, which then flashes to the New Testament and the idea that we are saved by grace through faith.
Yeah.
And so it's very intentional wording, and I just wish I would have spent more time on it. I wish I would have researched it more and been able to flesh that out more. And that's where I would have gone with it, is looking at the differences between the two, and why does this word by is used here, but why is this word through used here? And I think the conclusion that I would have come to is the conclusion I'm coming to here, is the idea of you have the by of the Old Testament and pre-Jesus, and the through of by grace through faith. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I would have dropped. I just wish I would have spent more time on it. I wish I would have been able to go there. I just didn't. Yeah. I just wasn't able to. So,
well, and even just hearing it, just seeing, like you were kind of saying, their circumcision was by faith. So by faith they were circumcised, and their faith was already working in, and kind of where they were currently. But the Gentiles, they don't have the circumcision. They don't have any of those things, but they would be justified through their faith, like as a working through their faith, and how it transpires in their life from then on, as opposed to from then before. Something like that. Like it's a timing kind of thing. I don't know. I haven't researched it either. So
that was part of it. Is I just was kicking myself for not even researching it. Yeah. And I think at times, I see a question coming up here of just the research aspect. At times there's so much to research, and there's so much that is just overwhelming that you feel like if you start going down a road that you're going to get so off in the weeds. But I wish I would have got off in the weeds on this. And that's kind of where I wish I would have gone, is I wish I would have been able to spend more time on it and really be able to flesh it out and be able to help us see the reality that Paul is trying to make of circumcision versus uncircumcision. And that, as we talked about in the sermon, that God is the God of not only the Jews, but also the Gentiles. Yeah. And what does that mean? And that his salvation is offered to both. And so I wish I would have spent more time. It was what happened.
And you thought that kind of the overall theme, like if you were going to put it kind of in a nutshell, where do you think God was really leading you to communicate to the church? Like if you were going to summarize your own sermon.
Well, I think it was just straight up gospel. I think it had to be gospel. I think it was the reality of who Jesus is and what he's done, and how are we justified? How are we made right before God? And I think then looking at the incredible reality of propitiation and of atonement and what is the process. I think what hit me was just the incredible process by which we are saved. And I wanted the church to grab on to what was done and the process by which we are saved, and then what do we do with that? And so that's where I went. Like I went and I followed Scripture very faithfully. I tried, and I wanted to go with where it went, and I felt like the Scripture really in all reality, went faithfully with how are we justified, and what is that resulted in it for us
through the great exchange.
Through the great exchange. Yeah, exactly. So
okay.
So I wish I would have spent more time on that, but it is what it is.
Okay. So. Okay. My next question for you is, heard you say somebody that you were like, man, this was there was a lot to this, and there was so much I had to study.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to kind of pick your brain.
Yeah.
What was something that you were like, man, I really need to study this? What was that thing that was either difficult for you to understand? I mean, obviously you understand it, but difficult to understand to preach, or difficult, like all the nuances that I know you can get caught up in the weeds.
Oh, absolutely.
So what was that for you?
Oh, man. I don't know if there was one thing. I think for me, just the reality of the weight of this passage, and that Paul, there's so much to it. And Paul is moving off of, early in chapter 3, he's moving off of this courtroom scene kind of thing. And so this is the, lack of better words, this is the conclusion of the courtroom scene. This is where he's leading to, and he drops himself here. So I think the weight of realizing that he's been building to this, for several verses, not only for 3 chapters, he's been building, he's going to keep going, but he's been building to this moment of like, this is justification. And I think for me also realizing that there were several words that were used in this passage, that this is the first time they're being used. Propitiation, this was the first time, I believe. I think justification, this was the first time. And so
in Romans.
In Romans, yeah. And so the first time that these words are used in Romans, I mean, that carries massive weight.
Yeah.
The reality that he hasn't used those already, and now he's choosing to use these in these verses right now to bring about this incredible moment, man, that's just heavy. And so trying to piece together everything that was happening, trying to make sense, because if you look at the passage, it feels very circular. He keeps saying almost the exact same thing over and over again. He keeps talking about we're justified, and this is how we're justified. Then he says it slightly differently, and then he wraps in propitiation, and then he wraps in this, and then he goes into this call and response. And so the research for me was weighty, because I just felt like I needed to understand, why does he keep saying almost the exact same thing again and again? Why does he keep kind of going around and around in circles? Why is he building? Why has he already said this, but now he says it again? Why does he say it again here? I mean, defining propitiation, I studied that in college, and so I can understand it, but then helping us understand that, and then diving into the mercy seat and diving into what does that mean, and not wanting to go down too much in the weeds, but feeling like if I didn't go to the mercy seat, that would be unfaithful to where he's going.
Because he said mercy seat.
Well, no, because the reality of the connection of propitiation is very clearly, every scholar was like, this is so clearly him flashing back to mercy seat. And they're like, this word carries similar wording that was used for mercy seat, the translations and everything. And so wanting to be faithful to make sure that I'm not diving too much into the weeds, but also feeling like if I didn't go there, where am I going to go? And so I think the research for me was weighty, because I felt like there was so much to it, and there was so much there, and it was very heavy. And how do I define this in a way that I don't water down the gospel? But how do I also make sure that I'm not, just spinning this as a college lecture? Like I don't want this just to be a college lecture. I want this to be a sermon. It has to be a sermon. It has to application to it. It has to have all this stuff. But how do I not also water down the gospel? And I think then on top of all that, feeling like it dropped us in the gospel itself, and so then wanting to be faithful to the gospel, and wanting to be faithful to teach the gospel well, that we understood the gospel well, and that we walked away knowing the gospel. So the research for me was just heavy because of that. And I'll be very honest, going off of one sermon into another, I had some youth events in the middle of that. It just was heavy. My family was in town. There was just a lot of extra stuff for me. On top of all that. A lot of distractions. Good distractions, but a lot of distractions. And so feeling like I just was overwhelmed with the heaviness of it, overwhelmed with life stuff, overwhelmed with, other responsibilities, and feeling just very pulled. And so I dropped myself into Sunday of just feeling like, oh my goodness, here we go. Like, am I ready? Am I not? Like, and so there was just a lot there. Some of that self-talk that we don't often share with other people.
The burden of the good burden of preaching, of like, man, this is important. And I need to get this right. But then, you're also a human, and you have families. And so, no, I get that.
And I think there was an aspect of that I truly just enjoyed the Luke 15 passage. That one was fun. That was easy, just kind of being very vulnerable. That was easy for me to study. That was easy for me to prep. That was easy for me to preach. And then I go into Romans, and that one was really hard for me to prep. I think there was just a lot of life stuff going on, and then it's just the weightiness of it. Luke 15 it's a narrative, and narratives, in my opinion, are just easier to prep. They really just provide everything you need right there. Like the narratives is easy, and you go into Paul, and Paul is tough.
Yeah.
Paul is not easy to understand, much less than be able to then preach.
Yeah.
And so I think it was just the research of trying to make sure that I was in the right place and that I gave the adequate amount of time and research and understanding to then be able to not only get it myself, but then be able to digest it enough that I was able to then...
To communicate.
Yeah. And so it was just heavy. Yeah, there was a lot to it.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question, which, by the way, I didn't see any questions on our OCC podcast email. So if you're listening and you wanted to send in a question, but maybe you forgot or you didn't know how, you can always either just fill out a connection card or you can send in questions to occpodcast@lewistonocc.org.
Yeah.
We really want to help you guys dive into Scripture and the message and really ask questions and push back on us. We are not perfect. We do our best, as Andrew said, to study and make sure we are being true to the text and true to the gospel. But if there's something that we say that you're like, hey, I'm really struggling with that, or I'm really curious about that, we want to know so that we can either clarify or provide you with a little bit more truth to help you understand God's will for your life. So anyway, so go ahead and send in those questions or write them in or even just pull us aside and talk to us one-on-one and say, hey, I really had a question. We'll sometimes mention those in the podcast as well. But anyway, I wanted to throw that out there. But okay, the next question I have, so you read a commentary on stage and you read that huge passage and it was talking about God being just in allowing sin to happen and not really doing anything about it until Jesus came. And that was a form of God's justice.
Forbearance was the word that he used at the time, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I, just for clarity's sake, like what was the kind of the heart of that? Because as I was kind of listening to it, I was like, oh, I'd be really interested to see, because even, because you quoted the commentary, it was so long that I think possibly some people, myself, may or may not be included in that. But just to kind of give clarity to what kind of you were trying to say in that moment.
Yeah, it was long, and I really wrestled with whether or not to put that in there. And I said in the sermon, like, I like to put commentary stuff in there, not only to show what the process has been, but also to bring kind of a stamp of, hey, this is research, this is solid people, this is,
This is expert advice.
This is expert advice. Yeah. Like, there are much smarter people than me that have studied this much longer than I have, and this is the process that we go by to get where we're at.
Yeah.
The idea of forbearance is such an interesting one, and that's the patience that we see. Is forbearance is the understanding of patience. And I'll tell you, that verse was really, really hard for me to study and really hard for me to interpret because...
And that was 25, right?
25, I think it was. Let's see here. We're both pulling out our phones to look at it. Yeah. Yes, it was. Divine forbearance, he passed over former sins. So that was really tough. That verse was really tough for me to understand because I'm looking at that and I'm like, what is happening here? What do you mean he's passing over former sins? My brain goes back to the Old Testament, and throughout the Old Testament where we see God really kind of laying out some severe punishments on Israel. I mean, we have the time in the desert. We have the way that he interacted with the Israelites for their time, different sins. We see, you think to right after Jericho and Ai and the way that God interacted with Achan. I mean, God leveled them at times. And so then I'm like, what do you mean he passed over former sins? And I think the clarity needs to be that it's not that God just said, I'm not going to touch anything that Israel does, and I'm going to let Israel just go wild. I think that there's a reality that God, in his divine understanding and ability to know what is coming, God is outside of time. And so his ability to know what is coming, he's chosen at times to deliver harsh punishments on certain sins for Israel, but then allow patience and wait on other sins. Now, exactly what that means, I don't know. Like, I don't know exactly. I don't know why God chose some sins and not others. Like, why did God choose to go after Achan for the sins of Ai and the sins of Jericho? Why did he choose that? And why did God make Israel wander in the desert for that many years? Why wasn't that the part of that God had patience on, Yeah. But then you also have to think that true justice because of sin, humanity's sin, true justice would just be death. True justice by God would be wiping Israel off the face of the earth, wiping everyone, wiping us off the face of the earth. You know, the lightning striking. That's true justice, and that's hard for us to understand. That true justice is just complete and absolute. Boom, done.
Yeah.
And so I think that we need to understand that God showed restraint because he is loving, because he is grace-filled, because he is merciful. And he chose at times to say, no, I'm gonna punish here, but I'm going to be restrained, show restraint here. And I think part of it is the reality of God knowing what is coming. And knowing that his son is coming to die on the cross for the sins of the world and offer salvation that is going to cover past, present, and future sins. And that Jesus' death is going to offer that salvation, offer the blood payment, right, to use the idea of the mercy seat, to offer the covering, the atonement that is going to cover all that.
Yeah.
So that's a tough one. And I'll be very honest, preaching that and studying that, I didn't come to a firm conclusion on exactly how that works. But that commentary helped me understand at least somewhat of why the idea of divine forbearance is there, and why did God choose to pass over certain sins, is because God knows what is coming.
Yeah.
And so explaining that is tough because we don't have the mind of God. We don't know why God chose here and why God chose to deliver wrath here but not here. So very honestly, I'm still wrestling with that, and I don't have a firm answer, but that's where my process went.
Yeah.
And because it was so convoluted and it was a tough section, I wanted to bring in a commentary to say, hey, here's the research that I went through to come to the place that I'm in, and here's what the expert has said. Hopefully this helps you in your understanding.
Yeah.
And so that's where I went.
Yeah. Well, it's like God allowed, like you were saying, God allowed certain sins to go unpunished.
Yeah.
Because he knew that ultimately all sin would be punished in Christ.
Yes.
That Jesus would bear that punishment.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
he would be just, but also gracious and forgiving.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, like you said, how that works and why that works, that's above our pay grade. So it would be nice to know everything, but unfortunately we don't. So
and I think that there has to be an element of, this idea of the divine forbearance and God passing over former sins would be another one that I wish I could have taken more time on. But I feel like I already dove enough into it that diving much further, would have been just so deep that I didn't feel like I had time to go into it.
Yeah.
And so there's a reality that I wish I would have studied it more, but there was also, I felt like I came to a place that I was solid enough to preach what I preached.
To give an answer.
Yeah. But I wish I could have spent way more time on it.
Sure.
Because that's a crazy statement to make. And Paul makes it and just keeps going.
Yeah.
That's the crazy reality of who Paul is. He just makes these statements, and at times he'll go deep into it and explain it so we have an idea. But other times he'll make a statement, one sentence, period, and then just he'll go.
Yeah.
And I'm like, whoa.
So do you think then, because of the audience of Romans, that they would have understood it better than we did? Or do you think Paul does that in that one, just saying, hey, this is what God did. He allowed that because Christ was coming. Let's move on. Yeah. Because the readers would go, oh yeah, that makes sense.
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, we have to think of the audience of Romans.
Yeah.
And so I think that he is speaking to the church in Rome, but the church in Rome would have been a combination of both Jews and Gentiles. And so that is part of the reason that Paul is writing this book and he's including both groups, is because it would have been a combination. He spends so much time talking about Jews and what God has done for them, but also spends so much time on the Gentiles because the beautiful marriage that God has brought there.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if they would have just been like, oh yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
I think there's sections when Paul talks about being is God the God of Jews or the Gentiles also, I think they would have gotten that and been like, whoa, yes, I get it. I don't know with this one. I really don't. I think I'm hoping they would have. I'm hoping that it would have made more sense to them. For us sitting here today, I think we can get to our understanding, and the understanding I came to, I got there, but there's still a lot of questions that I have.
Sure.
And it would take a whole lot more research, and truly it probably will take me meeting Jesus to really, truly get an answer that, is a real solid answer.
Yeah. No,
So,
I like that.
What are your thoughts on it? Because that's a tough one.
I didn't research it, so I don't. I would assume that is why sometimes Paul does that, is because the audience would get it. So I would preliminarily assume that they would go, oh yeah, that makes sense, and that there's just a cultural gap that we're not getting. Because even the Gentiles would have been immersed in that Jewish culture and the Jewish customs and kind of understanding. And, but yeah, I don't know. But I think you explained it well by saying, yeah, like God did punish certain sins. Other sins weren't punished, and God let those go out of his forbearance because he knew Christ was coming. Yeah. And because God is outside of time, not out of time. God is outside of time. That for God, it's like, no, this makes sense. Like everything, all the puzzle pieces fit together because it's God's perfect plan. Yeah. But for us, we're kind of like, we don't get it. Yeah. And so, but I think to explain it that way is it seems to make sense to me. So.
And I think for me, I felt like it was the most faithful way to explain it. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about research, like that's where the research dropped me. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of times I'll research things and be like, I don't agree with that commentator. I just don't. Yeah. And so then I research it more and I'm like, this commentary explains it in a way that makes sense. And I agree with this commentary. And so I settle on it. Yeah. And so, I really try to have a bunch of commentaries open and I try to, compare commentaries. And I have my favorite one, but I also like to compare them and be like, well, this one's good, but I don't know about it. I agree on that. And so it's a process. And so like, I always want to be processing things on my own and make sure I'm not just like leaning so heavily on commentaries, but that's also part of our training, right? Yeah. Is to learn how to read and respect people who have done the study and then help us in our study because we need to do it on our own and we can lean on commentaries too. Yeah. So,
yeah. No, I get you. All right. My last question. You mentioned in your sermon that we don't really know who Jesus' ransom was paid to. Yeah. You said it wasn't paid to Satan. You did make that very clear. Yes. It was not paid to Satan. But you're like, we just don't know. This is one of the great mysteries. I believe that was kind of how you said it. So first question would be, why wasn't it paid to Satan? I know that some of the early church fathers believed that it was to Satan.
They did, yes.
But what is that, like, why do we not have that understanding now?
I think that, that's a tough one. That's a huge question. In my understanding, yes, you're right. Some of the early church fathers believe that. And in our reality and our understanding now, I would push back on that heavily because then that puts almost, in the way I would explain it, that puts God in submission to Satan. That Jesus had to, God had to pay the penalty to Satan, and that has put him in submission to that. And so I would push back on that heavily, that there isn't an exchange paid to Satan. That now Satan holds, for lack of a better explanation, God's money. Mm-hmm. And so I would stop that. I don't think that there's any submission to Satan. Mm-hmm. I think that God is ultimately in control. I know that there's at times people would hold that, the payment was almost just paid right back to God. I would struggle there a little bit on what does that actually mean and what does it mean that he paid it to himself. But I think that the way I stood on it was that it's one of the great mysteries, that there was a payment, the atonement was paid, but what is that? My honest answer is I'm not sure. Okay. But based on the words used and the understanding used, going back to the mercy seat, going back to propitiation, going back to atonement, we understand that there was a payment that was paid. Yeah. But I would push heavily on the idea that it was paid to Satan. Yeah. Because that would give Satan lordship or authority where he does not have lordship or authority. Kind of something like that? Is that what you're saying? That's where I would go. Yeah, the submission idea lordship would be another great way of explaining that because Satan's not in control. Yeah. God has allowed him to run certain things, but that's by God's design. That's by God's authority, not by Satan's. Yeah. And so even paying anything to Satan, I would struggle with that. For lack of better words, if we sat here and we had to agree that I would pay you a chunk of money, for you to let me do something, in many ways, you are now over me in that. Mm-hmm. I've paid, and now I've set myself under your authority. I've had to pay that money to release whatever's happening, and so now I'm under your authority. Yeah. And so I would struggle that any payment was given to Satan, and that now places Satan as having authority over God. Mm-hmm. I would reject that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, yeah, and it would put Well, I'm just trying to think of.
Yeah, it's a tough thought process.
Well, I've never really wrestled with it because I always thought it was to God. That was always the thing. It was like, no, God is the judge. We've sinned against God. We didn't sin against Satan. Satan deceived us. Yeah, but we don't belong to Satan. Satan didn't create us. So when we sin to God, and God, being the just judge, condemns all sinners righteously and justly. Yeah. And so then God sent his son to make that payment that would suffice his wrath. And so since we're being saved from God's wrath, we're not being saved from Satan's wrath, or we're not being saved from Satan's grasp. Yeah. We're being saved from God's wrath. Therefore, that's who the payment goes to.
And I think theologically that one makes the most sense. But I think it's also, I don't, for me, in the timing that I had and the space that I had, making that comment based on the research that I did, it was easier to say, we can't get here. We can't explain all this. And it's a great mystery. But looking at the reality, I think it's an easy way to go. But I don't know if I have enough. I'm not willing to stand firmly on that yet.
Okay.
And that's a strong one to be like, God is now paying himself. What does that mean?
Sure.
I think that's also the breakdown of our human understanding, placing that on God. Our human understanding of saying money has to be exchanged, is a tough thing to place on God. And I think we have to be careful as humans placing anything of our human understanding or our wording on God. And so the way that God went about that, the way that exchange happened, that's a great mystery that is only understood by God. We can try to place human understanding or our human words on it, but I think we got to be careful with that. It's a tough thing. And I think I wanted to make sure that we as a church did not engage in, based on my research and everything, in heresy. And even though early church fathers went there, I think we have to push back on the idea of being paid to Satan. I really do. And
I think you did that.
Yeah, and I pushed back on that heavily, but I wasn't ready to stand on a conclusion that I hadn't spent the time in yet. Yeah. And so, yeah.
Okay. All right.
It's a super interesting thought, and it's a super interesting verse there, and I wrestled with it immensely, but I just wasn't ready for that. And so that's the process of do we write a paper on it, or do we have to preach a sermon and get through where we're at and make sense of it?
I appreciate you being honest and being vulnerable. Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up Romans 3?
It was a joy to do. It was, as we mentioned, it was tough. It was fun. It was engaging, but it was a really interesting one. And there's a lot there that I just felt like I couldn't nail down. But yet at the exact same time, how do I get to a place where I can communicate it, but also be vulnerable and be like, hey, we're still working through this. And so I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, hey, thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So next week, or this week, not next week, this week, James is back and he's preaching Romans 4, 1 through 5. And it's only 5 verses. So I'm going to read, I have the NASB. I'm going to read the NASB one. Okay. This is the 2020 though. I know James uses the 1995, but whatever. He won't say anything. Okay. So this is the passage that James is going to be preaching on. What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, the wages are not credited as favor, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Wow. So that's what James is going to be preaching on. If you could be praying for him and praying for just God to move, and honestly for hearts to be open to what God has to say. And, we're taking our time to go through Romans because it is as a powerful book that obviously has changed lives and is one of my favorites. I love Romans.
It's solid.
So just be praying for James, be praying for yourselves, be praying for your family, be praying for people just walking through the doors that they will be receptive to the Holy Spirit moving, because the Holy Spirit is going to be doing his thing. So just be praying for that. Anything else you want to say before we conclude?
No, this was a joy. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks guys. be sure to join us. You can watch us online live, or you can come and visit us in-house at OCC. Our services are at 8, 9, 45, 11:30.
There it is.
8, 9:45, 11:30 on Sunday morning, and then Monday night it is 7 p.m. I don't know why that's so hard for me to understand.
Dude,
I've been here
VBS.
4 years.
It's VBS.
Yeah.
Bro.
Okay.
It's
Thank you.
It's a rough week.
So thankful for you guys to spend your midweek with us. God bless you guys. Know that you are so loved by God and everybody here at OCC.
Have a good one.